Vermont's rural schools are under attack, and small schools all across the state, just like this one, are in danger of being closed. It's locked. Which I guess isn't too crazy because I am recording this video on a Sunday and the school is usually closed on Sunday. But it's not hyperbole when I say that this school has problems and there is a decent chance it could get closed down in the not too distant future.
The statewide system is broken.
Why on earth are we talking about dramatically harming my town?
Montpelier just had their way with us.
Is that fair that we're having to go through this process?
So is that a no?
So it's a yes and.
But if that is taken away from the voters, to me, that's a big problem.
If they didn't merge, they'd be isolated.
Are you a native Vermonter? No. That tells me something. What the hell don't you got back?
Tylenol PM. I don't know what I would have done in the last 5 days without it.
For those who don't know me, my name is Morgan Gold. I'm a farmer, a writer, and I also make videos on the internet. But at the end of the day, I care deeply about my community, Peacham, Vermont. It's a tiny little town of about 700 people, and like a lot of rural places, it's facing some big challenges. And in full disclosure, I serve as Peacham's district treasurer for the school board. I don't have children, and my wife and I have no plans to have children, but I do believe strongly that schools are essential to small communities. And much like everyone else living in Vermont, I am seeing the problems that we have with our state's education system. On the one hand, these schools are the lifeblood of small towns, providing education and a sense of identity and stability. On the other hand, though, Vermont's cost of living is rising rapidly, and the state's education system is one of the most expensive systems in the country. Property taxes are straining working Vermonters, and maintaining the expenses of small schools with a declining enrollment is becoming harder to justify. Lawmakers in Montpelier have been wrestling with this problem for decades. Act 46, which was a law passed about a decade ago, was supposed to help solve the problem and consolidate school districts and cut costs and make things more efficient. But in many places, all it did was consolidate some school boards while the bills kept climbing. Governor Phil Scott wants to take it further, and he recently proposed 5 massive regional school districts for Vermont. And with that change, the fate of dozens of small schools across the state could hang in the balance. The challenge is finding a way forward that balances the financial stability that we all need, but also keeps schools in local communities, because schools are what keeps those local communities vibrant. Folks in tiny little towns like Peacham know that once a school is gone, it almost never comes back. Families leave, businesses struggle, and property values drop. Slowly, the town fades away. Now, the real question is, what caused this problem for Vermont? And the good news is I have an answer, and it started roughly 450 million years ago.
Ah, Vermont, a land of rolling hills, rugged ridges, and winding river valleys. But the Green Mountain State is also home to one of the most expensive school systems in the United States of America. How did this come to be? Why, to answer that, we must journey back, way back, 480 million years ago to be exact, to the Paleozoic era. It was then that mighty tectonic forces clashed, forging the Green Mountains and sculpting Vermont's signature terrain. But nature wasn't finished yet. During the Great Ice Age, colossal glaciers rumbled through, carving deep valleys and scattering boulders, all of this reshaping the land into the dramatic contours that we see today. And what does this mean for the modern traveler? Well, unlike the broad, flat plains of the Midwest, where highways stretch in straight, orderly lines, Vermont's roads had to conform to the land itself. Instead of imposing order, they followed the path of least resistance. That's why our interstates, namely I-89 and I-91, trace the paths of the ancient river valleys, skirting the rugged highlands and hugging the state's borders. But for those venturing east to west, Vermont lacks a true cross-state interstate, leaving travelers at the mercy of winding state highways and patchwork roads like U.S. Route 4. And here's a curious fact. Vermont boasts the highest dirt-to-pavement ratio of any state in the nation, with more than 8,550 miles of dirt roads compared to just 7,213 miles of paved ones. The Green Mountain State offers an adventure at every turn. So whether you're heading north, south, east, or west, remember, Vermont's roads aren't built for speed, they're built for...
In 1777, the newly independent Vermont Republic did something radical. It made education mandatory. Every town had to have a school. The state's constitution even put it into writing.
A competent number of schools ought to be maintained in each town unless the General Assembly permits other provisions for the convenient instruction of youth.
Now understand, this wasn't just some aspirational decree. This was about survival. Vermont's geography doesn't lend itself to easy centralization. It never has. If kids were going to learn, the school needed to be close, like trudge through 3 feet of snow uphill both ways close. And so by the mid-1800s, Vermont had more than 2,500 one-room schoolhouses, because every town, every valley, every high-altitude pocket of humanity had its own school. And in this place and in this way, kids learned their letters, where neighbors gathered for meetings, and where democracy happened in real time. These schools had already disappeared from much of the country by the early 1900s, but in Vermont, they were still at the heart of the town. And by the mid-20th century, though, as roadways improved a bit, the state rightly pushed towards consolidation. Bigger, better equipped schools, more teachers, more resources. Other places had already done this, but Vermont had resisted out of practicality. Slowly, though, one-room schoolhouses began to disappear. One by one, they closed. By 1960, nearly 90% of the one-room schoolhouses in Vermont were gone, and by the 1980s, only a handful remained. And just as a fun little fact for you guys, there's actually still a one-room schoolhouse in operation in Vermont. There's only one, but the Elmore School is the last functioning one-room schoolhouse in the state. And the reality is, Vermont isn't all that far removed from its history of one-room schoolhouses. In fact, I know lots of folks here in Peacham who actually attended school still in those one-room schoolhouses. My next-door neighbor, Frank, is one of those folks who's done that. And I figured it would be good to go find out what that experience was like. Ooh. Hey there, I didn't realize you guys were under quarantine. Oh.
We both have COVID.
What I might do is reschedule. Do you guys need anything? Huh? Do you guys need anything from like the store, or?
I sent Maddie a note and said if he was coming by, if he could drop off some syrup, because I'm out. So.
All right, well, if you do need anything, just text me or let me know, and I'll just follow up with you probably Thursday or Friday or something like that. Hope you guys feel better. So both my neighbor Frank and his partner Patrice came down with COVID, so we might have to wait until a future video to talk about one-room schoolhouses. But I do know a lot of folks might be wondering, what does school in Peacham, Vermont look like today?
When I think of Peacham, I think of like town meeting days. Everyone in the community there to literally voice their vote. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. The first town meeting I ever did, it was like something I'd always been looking for. I mean, that was democracy to me. And I'll never forget my first tractor parade experience and riding in a tractor parade with my Little League baseball team and seeing so many people there just celebrating. I grew up moving around a lot from town to town and never really had a sense of place. And since I've been here, I really felt what I think I've been missing my whole life and didn't even know it.
This is Sam McLeod. He's the principal of Peacham's elementary school.
This entire hallway represents the entire school. We have combined classrooms. We have a standalone kindergarten just because philosophically, I believe that kindergarten is its own thing. The library is part of the new addition that was put in the 90s. And this is our first and second grade classroom. They're split now between academics and cross-country skiing.
Peacham kids go skiing. Peacham kids go skiing. It's an enrichment activity that is supported by community volunteers.
We have cross-country skiing with our whole school, and all of the volunteers out there helping, the vast majority of them don't have kids in the school. A lot of them don't even have grandkids in the school. They're community members. And I know the value of small schools to a community is in that identity. And without it, I've seen examples where, towns lose their identity and it kind of just dries up.
When you look at the last property tax cycle and what that did and some of the increases that folks got, that they're like, how are we going to do this when cost of housing is increasing, cost of fuel, food, pretty much insurance, everything? How do we balance that challenge of keeping our small rural schools open while at the same time keeping Vermont affordable for folks?
We're literally operating on the essentials. And we have combined classrooms. We're not building, putting in new buildings. All of our extracurriculars are funded by our PTF or through fundraising. They're creative things that, that we can do without taking away educational opportunities for kids. Some of those are sharing resources with our other communities, including personnel. We do that in some small ways. We share music teachers, we share art teachers.
Peacham Elementary School is also now sharing its principal, where Sam is now splitting his time between Peacham and Barnet.
Just speaking to the cost of running schools, the vast majority of that has been inflationary and very much outside of our control. I don't know how to control inflation.
Now, no shade to Sam, but I don't think anybody knows how to control inflation.
This is inflation. This is tic-tac. This is tic-tac. This is inflation. This is what's happened.
Now, the cost of education and education reform is a very hot topic in Montpelier. And there is an expectation that certain laws are going to be proposed and certain changes are going to be made over the course of the next few months. And so to get a sense of what the picture looks like, I figured I would reach out to my representatives in Montpelier. And so specifically, that's Scott Beck.
Scott Beck. Who the heck is Scott Beck?
Longer time viewers might remember Scott from last year's video where I gave job interviews to political candidates. All right, Jen, you're getting tossed. Come on, sweetie. And so he was elected as our state senator, and he was also actually named as the Republican minority leader in the Senate. How would you articulate the situation Vermont's in right now when it comes to its K through 12 education?
It's becoming rather sparse. We've seen a decrease from about 115,000 kids to about 83,000 kids. The numbers of kids in our schools are different. The numbers of kids in our classrooms is different than it was 20 years ago. And we have a very expensive system. I think as of this year, I think we may be almost near the most expensive system. We're a state with an average tax base. And so to fund a system that is that expensive with an average tax base puts a lot of pressure on taxpayers. We heard that loud and clear in the last election that they wanted something done. In Vermont, our teachers, they make about the national average. We don't have a really exorbitant teacher salary schedule. And so some people might ask, so how, if we have just average salaries, how come we have almost the largest cost of education in the country? And I think where that sugars off in an industry where 80% of costs are personnel based is the number of adults that we have employed in our schools. Mm-hmm. The core problem that we've had that has led to this situation that we are in is when we moved to a statewide education fund, we, to a very large degree, disconnected a local school district's spending decision from its tax rate. When an average district decides to spend another dollar, they know that they're going to come up with 30. They're locally going to have to come up with 30 cents. Mm-hmm. So this is not an incentive to slow down spending.
So the funding formula is specific.
The funding formula is a large contributor.
Vermont's education funding formula makes no sense. The more you learn, the more you feel dense. I tried to read the budget, but I fell asleep. Woke up taxed twice, now my wallet's weeping deep. Ask Montpelier why they just shrug and say funding formulas just be confusing that way.
What the hell is this, Marcus?
I don't know, I've never gotten here before.
What is this?
Oh my God, what are you looking at?
I don't know, I've never gotten here before.
I mean, I think it's hard to overstate how unique Vermont's public education system is, especially the way that we pay for it. It's completely unlike any other state. And so I think because of the crisis that we're in, there's a large appetite to make the state a little bit more like everyone else. The hope there is that might mean we get out of this cycle of increasing costs.
There's so many different types of school systems, right? We have towns tuition. We have public dollars going to schools out of state, out of country. That was wild to me. My first day on House Ed, sitting there and being like, why is Switzerland on the list of schools that we fund? That was new to me.
I'm really about trying to find, an operational system that is simple, that's understandable, that's efficient, and just really tries to make life easier for everyone involved.
If you were a kid in a wealthy Vermont town in the 1990s, your school had everything. Gleaming new textbooks, a top-tier science lab, and they might have even had a pool.
Hey, no running on my watch.
But over in the next town over, the poorer one, your school would be lucky if it had history books that mentioned a president past Richard Nixon. Now, why was this discrepancy? Well, it was because Vermont towns used to fund schools almost entirely through local property taxes. That meant that rich Sorry, it's hard to talk when my cat climbs on me. That meant that rich towns got well-funded schools, and the poorer towns, they were basically left with whatever their town could cobble together. But then came 1997, when a student named Amanda Brigham and a few of her classmates sued the state, pointing out the obvious fact that funding schools based on zip code alone was unfair. The Vermont Supreme Court essentially said, yeah, you can't just give some kids a world-class education while others are stuck in budget-cut purgatory. So enter Act 60, which was Vermont's first attempt at fixing things. The idea was simple. You create a statewide property tax, pool the money together, and spread it out more evenly. And that sounds fair, right? Well, the wealthy towns, they hated it because suddenly their school money wasn't just their school money anymore, and the outcry was deafening. And so after enough yelling, Vermont tweaked the system even more, and it came up with Act 68, which complicated everything but still tried to stick to the basic idea of fairness. And then you fast forward and things kept getting more expensive. And then given the state's sparse and scattered population, Vermont just had a lot of tiny school districts, each with its own administrators, expenses, and bureaucracy. So in 2015, the state decided to try out Act 46, which was a big push to consolidate school districts. Fewer districts, lower costs, better efficiency. That was the sales pitch that Vermonters got 10 years ago.
Boy, that sounds familiar.
But it's not quite how things worked out because not enough schools closed to make the math of something like the proposal in Act 46 actually work out. As Scott said, Vermont spends more per student than almost any other state, yet plenty of schools are still struggling, and the property taxes are going through the roof. But the problem is, we have a funding formula for our schools that really doesn't help any of us. And yes, the governor and lawmakers are once again talking about overhauling the whole dang system, and I think everybody's heart is absolutely in the right place. But in order to talk about that, I got to be able to explain to you guys how the school system funding formula even works today, and it's much too cold to do it out here, so let's head inside. All right. So these are your property tax dollars. Or I guess to be more accurate, this is a representation of your property tax dollars that are collected by your town. Obviously not all towns are created equal, and so some towns have more property value, some towns have less property value. But as a result of the Brigham case, as well as the laws passed in its wake, the state of Vermont collects all of those property tax funds and puts them into one statewide general education fund. The state also has other funds that it puts in there, so for example, like the lottery, or the meals and rooms tax, or the sales tax. And they mix it all into this big pot, which again is the education fund. But then on a local level, what you have is each town and each school board is basically submitting a voter-approved school budget. And then the state basically has to take that education fund and spread it around to the various schools. So you get some to match your container, you get some to match your container. Frig.
I guess I've done a poor job.
But it might not have enough to match what the voters wanted. So the state goes back to everybody and says, you know what? Your tax rate has to go up just a little bit, and you're gonna have to kick in a whole little bit more here. so that everybody's cup is full. And it ends up making as much of a mess as I've made here on my kitchen counter. The goal of this whole Michigan system was to promote fairness as well as preserve local control, but it ends up doing neither of those activities all that well, and it makes the voters feel frustrated, and it makes the entire system feel very opaque. And I know I'm not the only one who has that opinion. And to top it all off, everything I just showed you here is a wild oversimplification, and I'm not even talking about important concepts like CLAs or per pupil spending thresholds or even income sensitization.
Vermont income sensitizes property taxes, meaning if your household earns below a certain amount, you get a tax credit.
Which applies to about 2/3 of the Vermonters who are paying property taxes into this system. Now, what Governor Scott and the Secretary of Education and a lot of other folks in the state want to do is move away from this convoluted system and move to something known as a foundation formula system. And what would essentially happen with that foundation formula system is the state would say, we're going to spend this much money per pupil, and then they do the math and say, well, this is how many pupils that we have, plus all their other sources of revenue, and they'd put it into the big education fund. And then based on the number of students in each school system, they would get their pro rata share. And so that way it is definitely fair. And there's adjustments that get made for if you have like more English language support or there's more drive times or that sort of thing. They'll actually make some adjustments in their calculations. But what you have is not funding from the state that matches the town's budget, but rather something that matches what their per pupil population is relative to the overall state funding formula. Something like this makes a lot more sense from a budgeting standpoint because it lets you look at the big picture and to a certain extent adjust some levels up and down, but at the same time it spreads the resources fairly. And so for those reasons alone, I think that that makes a lot of sense. But the truth of the matter is the devil is in the details. Like for example, if a school system like Peacham said, well, we really think it's important to preserve our school and we want to give more budget, we're going to add more money to top it off and make sure we have our full budget. What you have here though is a problem now where it's not fair, where there's more money being spent per pupil than in a lot of other places. But how exactly are we defining fair? Oh, that tastes like Windex. Does fair only come in the form of spending the exact same amount of money? Or is fairness measured in the types of educational experiences a school child gets? And I mean, gosh, if a kid has to take a bus an hour or two per day to get to their 3rd grade class, is that fair? And then to top it all off, how is the decision of budgeting actually made? Is it made by your local school board? If school boards are consolidated, do they get to make it? Do the residents in town actually have a direct say, or is it very indirect and have they lost control? All of these open questions still remain open questions, and I don't know about you guys, but I personally have a lot of anxiety for how those questions are going to get rounded out before some sort of new state act gets put into place. Yes, the governor and the Agency of Education have put out a new proposal, but even in that, there's still a lot of details that need to be ironed out. Like, for example, I just took a look at Peacham's budget for 2026 and used a lot of the assumptions that are contained within the governor's proposal. And from my research, what I saw is that there's roughly a 10% gap between what the bare bones budget need was versus how much money would be available for the school. And so when we're confronted with that big of a gap, what happens to the school?
Well, the big example in Vermont right now is what's happened to the Roxbury school.
This is Margaret McLean. She's my neighbor here in Peacham, and she's an international education consultant who was a principal here in Vermont, as well as a former member of the Vermont State Board of Education.
Roxbury was told under Act 46 that if they didn't merge, they'd be isolated and they'd need to provide their own supervisory union services, which was scary because those services can be expensive. So they discussed merger and joined with Montpelier, but the 9-member board has just one vote from Roxbury. Roxbury is 42 square miles. It is not contiguous with Montpelier. And after a year, the board decided that They would take the 5th and 6th graders from Roxbury, so it was K-4. And that went along fine until last year when their budget failed.
Montpelier Roxbury's budget failed on town meeting day as voters rejected a budget that would have resulted in a 24% property tax increase.
And basically overnight, they closed Roxbury.
The board voted to close the Roxbury Village School.
Now, this means that the Roxbury Village School will close next year, and students will have to travel to Montpelier.
In Roxbury, most voters voted yes to the budget. However, here in Montpelier, more people said no.
I think that just makes so much more sense for 40 kids to be bused over here.
Hannah Bryant is new to Roxbury with a child in the K-4 school. With the children heading to Montpelier, she's worried about the long bus ride and what the loss of the school will mean to the community.
This is really the heart of the community, and it's what's built our connections with the whole town.
Why on earth are we talking about dramatically harming my town? We're going to talk about killing Roxbury Village School irreparably. It's never going to come back in 2 months.
Pretty disappointed in the leadership of the school board in the district. Really, at no time did we feel that they really were fighting for Roxbury.
There is the document that I call our marriage contract, the merger document, okay, that it says that after 4 years of the merger, the board could take a vote and vote to close the school. But the school board members of that time recall the conversation was that we would never close that school based on budget alone. Tylenol PM, I don't know what I would have done in the last 5 days without it.
And so the folks in Roxbury, just like suddenly there's no elementary school in their town. It's gone.
The decision was made in March, April after town meeting. The school was closed in June, and in September, they were bused. To be bused from Roxbury to Montpelier currently takes 2 hours and 20 minutes a day. This is a K-12 bus they've needed to hire a bus monitor for, and it only meets the students on the one Route 12, the one main road that goes through town. Mm-hmm. So some children need to be transported 5 or 6 miles on dirt roads in their parents' car to the bus stop.
So wait, the bus stop is like 5 miles from their house?
5 or 6, yeah, because Montpelier buses don't go on dirt roads. Many parents had to make a quick decision over that summer a year ago, and many parents have chosen to homeschool, to not put their kids on the bus, because putting a 5-year-old on a bus for basically 2.5 hours a day makes no sense for families.
No more school in Roxbury. That was the Board of Ed decree. They shut it down, they closed the doors. Ain't no classrooms here no more. Put the kids on a bus today. Send them miles and miles away. No more school in Roxbury. No more kids, no.
You know, if you come to the Roxbury School today, which is actually right behind me, what you're going to find is right in the heart of Roxbury, the town, is this little vacant building. Actually, just a minute ago, I saw like a Montpelier Public Works guy here shoveling the sidewalk, so the building still needs to be maintained, but it's an empty, unused space. And my personal quick take impression is you're in a town that feels like it's had its heart ripped out. And if you talk to a lot of residents here in Roxbury, they're going to kind of share that same sentiment.
Roxbury went through a large transformation in the early 70s when I moved here. A lot of young people moved in. You know, it was the back to the land. You know, all the hippies moved here. Then we went through a period of actually, slow growth. And then a few years ago, young people started moving in again. We had a small school that people wanted to have their kids go to. I mean, there's a family that lived right up the road from me, and they have three small boys. And they just couldn't wait until their first kid could come down the hill and go to school. And it's, and now, where are they? They're in Barry at the, what's the Catholic school in Barry? I forget the name of it, but. So they're tuitioning them to that school. And several people, young families, another young family right up the hill, she's homeschooling. They just didn't want their kids on that bus for 2 hours a day. Where are young people going to move? They're going to move to Montpelier. The real cohesive part of a town is its grade school. When people move there and have kids, they meet each other, the kids get together, they grow up friends, the parents become friends. Everything centers around the school. The most important thing to me is that I don't think a school should be closed without a majority vote of the citizens.
Well, that sounds reasonable.
Like, the big thing I'm worried about is when I think about a town like Peacham, if we lose our school, I worry that we lose our town's future. You know, I can think of so many friends who have moved to our tiny little town in the last, 7-8 years that I've been here, who have young families and came here and cited really the elementary school that we have here as one of the reasons that got us to move. And if I think about what our town would be like without those folks here, I think it would be a significantly less vibrant community if those folks weren't here. And if we're thinking about attracting folks like that in the future, not having an elementary school would be an absolutely fatal blow.
Wait a minute. You're getting off the ground. Is that Bluey and Bingo on your bouncy ball?
How does he know Bluey and Bingo?
Wow, that's so cool.
We were looking for a home, and I grew up in Vermont, and we knew we wanted to stay in Vermont. So we kind of looked all over the state, and we were looking for, some place with property, an older farmhouse, which now maybe we regret, but we love it here, and we just happened to end up in a community that we really love.
A small community where there's so much, connection with everyone around you. I think that was like a key that, I had a bit as a kid, but not quite to the same degree of the small communities of Vermont. I didn't grow up in Vermont, so I moved here when we bought the house.
So now your oldest daughter is getting pretty close to school, right?
She'll start in the fall. Yeah.
So you're going to be going to Peacham?
Yes.
You want to go to the big school? I mean, I guess I feel like when we moved here, the fact that there was a school was definitely part of the attraction to move here. But I guess the more time we've spent here, the more I realize how important the school is to the community.
I don't know that it's possible to consolidate so many districts into so few districts. That seems incredibly extreme.
In Peacham, it's also unique in the sense that at some point our kids are going to not be going to school in Peacham. It's only K through 7. So K through 6. So our kids at some point will be driving them somewhere else. To keep youth in communities is, I think, such a key part of keeping Vermont beautiful.
All right.
Oh, blanket swing,
You
Bonnie?
ready? Bonnie likes blanket swing.
Are you ready?
When we were looking, we wanted to find an affordable house. That was the first thing. We bought our house back when it was affordable. Probably if we tried to sell it now, that would not be the case. But we knew that Peacham was a great community. It had a really active library. It had a great school, a good reputation.
And internet.
And internet. I mean, I don't know what Peacham would be without a school here. What else is there here other than the landscape? If you take that school out and that focus on the children and the families and that place that creates connections among us. Like, we have a lot of our friend network here was created around our children and the people that we've gotten to know through that school. So it would definitely change things.
When we think about population trends in Vermont and all the talk around getting the brain drain and folks not staying here, basically emptying out these rural schools and putting them into more concentrated areas doesn't really help with that challenge that we've had for decades. I think having these rural schools is a critical piece to encourage folks to make their families and lives here in Vermont. If we wanted a suburban or urban lifestyle, there are so many other choices.
Put yourself back 10 years ago as you were looking for houses. Would you have picked a community like Peacham if it didn't have an elementary school?
No.
No.
We didn't look at any towns that didn't have their own school.
Yeah.
Now, I know there's going to be folks out there who hear the plight of small towns like Peacham and say, hey, what's the big deal? So some people in a small town lose their little school and their kids are going to have to end up going to school in a town or two away. And Yeah, it's an inconvenience, but it's not the end of the world. Many folks I've spoken to for this project have said it themselves, that a big part of Vermont's school problem is the fact that it just doesn't have enough school kids. And while some folks might look at Peacham, Vermont and say that it's an exception to the rule, I would actually argue that it's proof of concept.
Now, whether youth flight is an existential concern or something that you can just barely see in the numbers, there is a Vermont town where the story is very different. A town that seems to attract young people like moths to a barn light. And the quality of the Peacham Elementary School were part of basically everyone's decision to live here. With all these young families coming into town, enrollment in the elementary school is up 35% since 2012, which is kind of remarkable, given that most Vermont schools are watching their numbers tick down. Peacham is striking an interesting balance. On the one hand, it's having a love affair with its past, and on the other, it's actively staking out its future. So maybe, with the right combination of old and new, you can attract young families.
When you have an inviting community that has a good school and has a community built around that school, your town is going to be much more likely to grow. And if you look at the data over the last few years, what you're going to see is it's the towns that have lost their schools that have been the ones that have been shrinking the fastest. Academic research data about this point is pretty clear too. Shutting down schools shrinks populations, crushes property values, and weakens local economies. A Cornell University study found that in upstate New York, villages without schools saw a nearly 20% decline in property values. Population metrics were also better. 61% of villages with schools grew, while only 46% of those without did. A 2021 Danish study found that school closures increased outmigration and weakened labor markets, making economic recovery nearly impossible. That same study also found that school closures led to higher per-pupil costs due to increased transportation expenses and the need for additional student services. Finnish research confirmed that school closures increased dropout rates. A 2015 study examining closures in Kansas found that community group participation dropped by 30% after a school was shut down. Youth organizations were among the hardest hit, with Boy Scout participation falling by 78%, and Little League Baseball collapsed entirely. Once schools left, the towns in the study fractured and resentment grew among residents. The overwhelming evidence is that closing a rural school might look like a budget fix, but it creates a domino effect that hurts home values, shrinks populations, kills local businesses, and widens income inequality. It shatters community cohesion, and it makes it nearly impossible for a town to recover. The numbers don't lie. Closing rural schools is a slow-moving disaster for the places that rely on them the most. And it shocks me that our state's leaders aren't looking at this information. I mean, heck, I'm just a farmer who spends way too much time scrolling Blue Sky and TikTok, yet I was able to find this information with just a little bit of Googling. I know we're all collectively facing tax pressures, but we can't cut our way to growth.
Bottom line is, our system is out of scale and very expensive. We need to take a hard look at how we govern and administer education. Put simply, we have a lot of buildings, classrooms, adults, and layers of bureaucracy, but fewer and fewer kids and taxpayers. We also have among the very smallest class sizes in schools in the nation. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. None of this will be easy. Let's be the ones who make the difficult decisions to move towards the real change the system needs and our kids deserve.
Republican Governor Phil Scott presented a budget plan Tuesday that he says will match the government's appetite for spending. He's proposing an education formula that would cut funding, he says, by over $180 million.
So I just heard about a special agency of education, Board of Education meeting that is happening this morning out in Montpelier, which is about an hour away from my farm. I'm very curious to see what's going to be said, given that it's all being done shortly after Governor Scott just released his funding proposal. So I think that it might be kind of interesting to attend this meeting. So let's check it out. So fun fact about me, I actually used to work in this building when I first moved to Vermont. The job I had it wasn't for the state, it was actually in that side of the building, but it was right in this building. Kind of weird to be back here. I'm here for the Agency of Education board meeting.
And we have concerns about the proposal to centralize rulemaking under the Agency of Education. This proposal raises serious questions about further diminishing checks and balances in Vermont statewide education governance. State boards should function as the citizen's voice in education and the stable center of education policy making.
The VSBA opposes the governor's proposal to move all rulemaking under the authority of the Agency of Education. The agency is not providing the data necessary to inform decision-making now and underperforms in fulfilling its statutory responsibilities, concentrating more authority in an agency of education that is unable to do the work it is currently responsible for is ill-advised.
There's a reason in our democracy that we delegate powers and responsibilities to different branches of government. Having a singular body to both create and enforce the rules is counter to that basic tenet of our democratic system. This is not the Vermont that we want. What happens to public input when we transition to a closed-door process where appointed officials from a governor's administration get to decide what rules are put in place and what rules are enforced?
The state board is really not designed or intended to be a check and balance on the agency. I think the shift is really thinking about how do we have clarity around roles and responsibilities to ensure that we're supporting a very exceptional public education system for the entire state. The rulemaking recommendation is really a practical recommendation. I do note your concerns. I think it's important for us to have these discussions, but I don't want to lose sight of the opportunity we all have ahead to thinking about how we strengthen our public education system. And we need to do that in a way that is responsible. We need to do that in a way that builds transparency and trust, and we're committed to that.
Placing rulemaking under the same entity that implements the rules, that is combination of power. That's consolidation under the governor. I don't see why we can't admit that.
I would disagree with that interpretation. I think what we currently have and what we'll continue to have moving forward is shared responsibility.
Now, just to be fair, I just took a 3-hour meeting and condensed it down to 2 minutes. But most of the meeting focused on Secretary of Education Zoie Saunders' proposal to shift rulemaking authority from the Board of Education to the Agency of Education, placing that responsibility under her oversight. The governor's proposals regarding school funding and district restructuring weren't discussed in depth as most of the board members felt they needed more information.
I need to see the plan of what are the implications of going to a foundations formula away from what we're doing right now. How does that affect quality and equity? It's nice to say it's going to be better, but I need to know how is that going to be better?
Until we can really understand how they might be implemented, I just don't think we have enough detail. I don't know that the legislature has enough detail.
The 5 specific districts, I don't believe that is a valid number that should represent the state. Coming from a region that's super rural, of course there are a ton of inefficiencies within education, but I've heard complaints and disagreements from just about every level, coming from educated students pertaining to the issue all the way up to very high up positions like superintendents, saying that that number will not represent our communities well.
For those who aren't from Vermont, Education Secretary Zoie Saunders is a somewhat controversial figure.
Zoie Saunders' path to this point has been rocky. She's received backlash for her past work with charter schools in Florida. That raised red flags among Vermonters and lawmakers.
The brevity of time that she spent in public education did not resonate with what I expected of a candidate for the most critical public education leadership role that we have in our state.
Vermont State Senate voted against Governor Scott's pick, Zoie Saunders, for the state's next education secretary.
She has faced some harsh criticism from lawmakers since the former Florida education leader was announced as the governor's pick.
When she first arrived in the state, the Democratic majority in the legislature refused to confirm her due to concerns about her ties to charter schools, her lack of experience as a teacher, principal, or administrator, and the fact that she was from Florida with no background in Vermont's school system.
In terms of toxic atmosphere and the partisanship, we thought we were some sort of special snowflake here in Vermont. where things like that didn't happen.
A pair of Vermont state senators are suing Governor Phil Scott for his appointment of Education Secretary Zoie Saunders.
The lawsuit claims that the governor purposefully circumvented his obligation to appoint a new Secretary of Education with the consent of the Senate.
However, after the most recent election,
despite backlash, today the governor officially appointed Zoie Saunders Education Secretary again.
After reading a lot about her and seeing her speak, I got really curious to get a deeper understanding of her take on rural schools. And so I reached out to her to see if she'd be up for having a conversation. And to her credit, she said yes. Hey there.
Hi. Good morning.
Well, really nice to meet you. I'm Morgan.
Nice to meet you, Morgan.
Tell me a little bit about your background. Where'd you grow up?
Yeah, I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and I've spent a lot of time there. Actually, my kids were the third generation born in the Broward County Hospital. I went to college at Harvard University, and I did my graduate program, my master's in education at Vanderbilt University. And a lot of my family actually moved to Vermont several years ago. And so my husband and I had been talking about moving back to the New England area to be closer to family. And the job opportunity kind of came up around that time. And we felt like it was the right moment for us to move.
That must have been really challenging moving here because, the response to you coming here was not necessarily positive. Like, what did that feel like?
So I understood when I moved here that I was coming in a really challenging situation for Vermont, where the state was really trying to think about how do we strengthen our public education system. And when that happens, it can bring a lot of strong emotions and feelings. And I was new to Vermont. Our schools are doing more than just educating students. Our schools are really serving as the hub of the community.
There's a lot of fear around losing our school because, as you said earlier, these schools really do serve as the heart of the community. We lose this school. How do we not become a community of just retirees and second homeowners?
Part of what we need to do is make sure that in every community, a student has access to a high quality local public school. And we have heard concerns around commute time. So we need to be practical in this work.
As you and the governor are working with the legislature to develop plans, can you offer any kind of surety to folks that, hey, local towns will always have final say of whether or not their school gets closed?
So I think at the end of the day, we need the community to be involved in all of these decisions. But something we've also heard is it's really hard to make these decisions at a local level, and it needs to be fair. And so we often hear communities talk about, we'd like to do this type of work, but if we're doing this and the town over isn't doing it, is that fair that we're having to go through this process? So part of the conversation.
So is that a no?
So it's a yes and, right? I think the state can have an opportunity to identify what are some of the criteria or the guardrails as you go into this work, and then engaging the community in that process as well.
Gotcha. Okay. So I'm sorry, I'm just unclear on that. So when you say it's a yes and, that means that the local towns won't necessarily have the final say, but their input's going to be incorporated. Is that what you're saying? I just want to make sure I don't misunderstand what you're saying.
Yeah. So part of, the future state is really thinking about how do we make sure that we're resourcing all of our schools to deliver on a high education quality, and that those schools are set up to be financially sustainable, right? So there are some expectations there of how we get to that place, and establishing what the criteria are will be important. And then the districts would be involved in engaging community input around how to make these decisions.
That makes a lot of sense. I think so much of the anxiety, though, comes in the form of, all right, when I look at the Caledonia Supervisory Union, which is where our school sits today, and yeah, 52 supervisory unions seems crazy and inefficient, but I think we'd end up in a district that's most of Northeast Kingdom. And so a lot of folks locally here struggle with, well, how does our voice still get heard when it's in this chorus of, 35 other towns?
Yeah. So one, I think the idea of community becomes expanded, right? It's yes, there's your town is your community, but it's also wrapping your arms around a larger of community where multiple towns come into play. ultimately, looking at the broader region, it will help us to be more equitable. And so, when you think about making decisions for, 200 students, maybe we're able to bring them all of the resources and services they need, but you might have a town over with the same number of students actually with higher needs that don't get those services. And so when you think about budgeting and policy decision making that encompasses a broader set of needs, that's where we're really able to be more equitable and thinking about how to ensure that higher needs communities are getting more resources to meet those needs. So it is a different way of thinking, and it is creating kind of more shared ownership of a larger group of communities.
What you're describing is such a radically different way than most Vermonters think about, quote unquote, their community today.
I recognize it's a shift, but I think we need to kind of engage in the dialogue around what we're trying to accomplish and making sure that anything that's passed really gets at that and gets at the heart of this, which is supporting students, making sure we're providing a world-class education and that it's equitable across the state. I know it's really important that we strike the right balance. We are a rural state, and we know that schools play a really big role in rural communities. And this approach that we're working on is really designed to strengthen schools and build vibrant communities.
Look at the wall, Shorzy. The other one. The other one. The other one! What does it say?
God, don't make him read it.
Where? At the top.
Just take it slow, buddy. Sound it out.
For the community, by the community.
So now this is probably the part of the video where you're looking at yourself saying, gosh, what's the solution here? It seems like Vermont is caught in a real catch-22. And if that's how you feel, you are not wrong. Collectively, as a state, we find ourselves a symptoms of cost disease.
Cost disease is when some things, like healthcare or education and housing, keep getting more expensive, even though they're not necessarily getting better or more efficient. Why does this happen? Well, it's because some industries, like manufacturing, can use technology to make things cheaper and faster. But other industries, like teaching or nursing, still need people to do the job, and you can't make a teacher teach twice as many kids or a nurse care for twice as many patients without problems. Since wages go up over time, but productivity in these jobs doesn't increase the same way, the cost of these services keeps rising. That's why a TV is way cheaper than it was 30 years ago, but college tuition or a hospital bill is more expensive. The idea was first explained by economist William Baumol in the 1960s, when he noticed that even though a string quartet plays at the same speed today as it did 200 years ago, the musicians still need to be paid more over time because of inflation, thus making the performance more expensive.
And so as we think about this premise of cost disease, I actually think it's the root problem that's crushing us as a state, and our education problems are only a symptom of that much greater cost disease problem. We're seeing the same issue when it comes to healthcare, right? And in fact, in most school districts, healthcare costs are the biggest driver of education spending. A few years back, all of our state's education, health insurance, and healthcare costs got grouped together and taken over by the state. Governor Phil Scott really strongly made the pitch to say that by consolidating in that form, things would get a lot cheaper. And the black and white objective numerical truth is they have not. And it's not that I think it's the governor's fault. It's just a problem that's far out of his control. But also please recognize that as you see our education spending continue to skyrocket, it's one of the biggest drivers. But yet in all of the discussion around education policy over the last few weeks and months, I haven't heard anyone talk about plans to reduce our health insurance costs. Nor have I heard anything about how to use technology to make our education system more productive and therefore less expensive. As I look out there and look at our major challenges as a state, things like education and healthcare and housing, like all of those things are goods and services that most economists would consider cost disease. And unless we were growing Vermont's economy to keep pace with those things, they were inevitably always going to catch up with us. And I think the reality is we're just starting to hit the tipping point. As a state, we have been in decline for more than 150 years, maybe 125 years, really depending on how you're counting. But ever since the start of the 20th century, it has been a long, steady, slow decline. Our state's economy used to be built on manufacturing, forestry, and agriculture. And, manufacturing has long since departed. I mean, generations ago at this point. Actual production style forestry has been long on life support, and agriculture at this point too is on life support. When I first moved to Peacham 7 years ago, there were, I believe, 6 dairies in operation here in town. These days, in terms of farms doing true traditional dairy, I think it's down to 3. I can't even imagine what it's going to be another 7 years from now. And the role that dairy played in Vermont, if you look back, say 50, 60 years ago, it was really serving as a tent pole. It stood up a lot of tiny little economies in these tiny little towns, and nothing has stepped up to replace it. Yes, folks are going to talk about the fact that, tourism, I just saw a report saying that it's now a $4 billion industry here in Vermont. But the reality is, if you look at the jobs and incomes associated with tourism, the vast majority of those jobs are not going to support households and families on a good, healthy, middle-class living standard. Yes, we can all point to a few examples where folks are able to make that kind of income from the tourism industry, but that's not happening for enough people. And as a result of that shift, our state's economy is really struggling because you don't have that tent pole standing up everything else. And you're relying on fewer and fewer people actually living here year round who can help drive the local economy. Of course, things are going to dry up. There are economic case study after case study showcasing the fact that austerity measures, where you're cutting costs in the name of reducing expenses, they never really work in terms of helping drive growth in a place. At best, they're going to let you tread water for a little bit until something cataclysmic happens and it creates a complete reset of the great order and economy of a place.
Press the reset button.
There are no silver bullets. No simple solutions to any of this. But in a state with so many crises, we need to start somewhere.
But how does it work?
Beyond acknowledging and openly discussing the reality of the challenges that our state is facing, here are a few things that I think we should do. We should streamline, but within reason. Yes, consolidation can make sense to a certain extent. The governor and secretary of education are right that Vermont has too many supervisory unions and management layers. Those are things that add expense. But 5 districts is probably too few. But somewhere between 10 and 12 evenly sized districts could make a lot of sense in balanced scale with best practices and local voices. But, and this is a big but, some aspects of local control should be protected. Specifically, whether or not a school gets shut down should remain in the hands of the communities it impacts the most. Closing schools isn't just a numbers game, and it's a choice with a profound impact that stretches far beyond education. Oftentimes, it's about keeping small Vermont towns alive. Furthermore, we need to recognize the massive difference between secondary and elementary school consolidation. Secondary students can benefit from larger schools with more resources, and they're better equipped for the travel times. But elementary schools, they're often the backbone of small communities. Shutting them down can gut a town's identity. They often form the foundation for community building in the future. And so any talk of consolidation has to acknowledge that distinction. Also, it's just plain messed up for a 7-year-old to have to ride a bus for 2 hours a day. The other thing that I think the governor is right about is moving to a foundation funding formula for schools. It's a much more logical approach. This could make schools more careful in the budgeting process, but the devil is in the details on this one. How do you appropriately fund the needs of a tiny rural school? How do we support schools in Burlington with significant English education needs, or schools in Rutland with a growing population of unhoused students? Just jumping to a raw per pupil spend approach needs to account for these complex realities. Also, towns need the ability to close funding gaps without being penalized for just wanting to keep their schools open. And while all of these changes are important, I also think we need to be looking for new forms of revenue. And on this one, I have an idea. It truly baffles me that we don't have an additional tax on second homes. You know, many folks are wondering how we pay for these expensive rural schools, and we also have a housing crisis going on in this state. You could kill 2 birds with 1 stone by taxing second homes. Somewhere between 15 and 20% of the homes in Vermont are either vacant or vacation homes. Adding just a 1% property tax on the assessed values of those homes could generate a lot of revenue. First, let's just streamline and simplify the whole homestead, non-homestead tax approach. Just have a business tax rate and a personal tax rate. Then when folks are filing their taxes here in Vermont, they have to declare where their primary residence is, and that home is taxed at the standard personal property tax rate. However, for any other additional properties you own, you must pay an extra 1% assessed value annually. Now, I went to art school, so I'm no tax attorney or accountant, but my back of the envelope guess is that somewhere between $200 million and $450 million per year could be generated by a tax like this. And while that's not enough money to solve all of Vermont's problems, it is most certainly enough to close the funding gaps that we're starting to see as we get into the budgeting cycle for the next go-around here. And now, how does a tax like this help the housing crisis? Well, if someone owns a second home but rents it out on a long-term lease, not Airbnb, long-term lease, they could qualify for a credit to reduce their tax burden. This would incentivize the placement of more long-term rental units in the housing market, which is something that Vermont desperately needs. Now, some folks might end up selling their second homes to avoid a tax like this, but that could actually help loosen up the housing market and create additional market liquidity. After all, our housing crisis is fundamentally a supply and demand issue. Yes, we need to build more houses, but something like this could very quickly increase market liquidity. We have the tools to build a more efficient and sustainable system, but only if we're willing to be bold and creative in our approach. Streamlining governance without erasing local voices, rethinking school funding without sacrificing community, and tapping into new revenue sources that align with our values are not impossible. They are choices. If we act with vision and courage, we can preserve what makes our rural communities unique while also strengthening them for future generations.
Shut up, Flatlander, don't tell me what's best. Your city ideas just ain't like the rest. Shut up, Flatlander, stop fixing our town. You move here, then whine till we tear it all down. Shut up, Flatlander, just learn how to cope. Your complaining has me at the end of my rope. Shut up, Flatlander, don't make such a fuss. Go back to Boston, leave Vermont to us.
Yes, it's true. I wasn't born here. I grew up in suburban Connecticut, spent most of my adult life living in cities like Boston and New York and Washington, D.C. I did not move to Vermont until I was in my late 30s, but I'm not the only one who feels this way. In fact, just the other day I was talking to my buddy Alfred.
My buddy Alfred, he lives on down the road. He's a wizard with machines, a genius in blue jeans. Let's stop and say hello.
If you guys don't know my buddy Alfred from some of my other videos, he is one of my neighbors who's also a stonemason. He's also on our town's select board. And last year, he even took a massive pay cut to take on the part-time work of driving our town's school bus just so the kids could have reliable transportation to school. And while my personal roots in Peacham, Vermont aren't all that deep, I don't think you can say the same thing about Alfred's.
You know, this kind of connection to this landscape is very much part of my identity, as much as being a father or being a stonemason. And I'm very much from Peacham. You know, I grew up in Peacham, but my family has roots going back 10 generations to the founding of Peacham. You know, one of my ancestors bought one of the original lots. I have 3 kids in the elementary school, 1 in each classroom. And the profound impacts that this is going to have on small communities like Peacham is too big of a decision to make without a trip to the ballot box, because I mean the effects are going to be just so devastating. I can't state enough how important the school is to the sense of community. You know, like this intergenerational shared experience is so fundamental to the closeness of the residents of this town. And I mean, how would you define community other than closeness of the residents of a town? if they close the elementary school and all the students just blow away into different schools like dandelion seeds into the wind, it's not going to take long at all. It's going to take 5, maybe 10 years, and this place is going to be a veneer, a pastoral veneer. Houses that are lived in by families today will be bought up for cash for second homeowners. You know, they're not all inherently bad, but they're not contributing to the work that's required to sustain a community. I guess I'm 9th generation, my children are 10th generation. Without a school in town, like, is my family gonna see an 11th generation in Peacham?
If you're out here and you're seeing this video and you want to make sure you can help save our rural schools, I will leave some links down below for you to be able to get in touch with the Senate Education Committee or your local representative or the governor or the Secretary of Education. Also, not to be too big of a Thomas Paine in the ass, I made a little zine that you can print out at home, and if you want to pass it out to your neighbors, whether it be at your local library or at your local school or town meeting day, it'll be right there. It'll be a PDF you can download and you can print it off and fold them and hand them out. Because I learned a whole bunch of interesting things while making this video, and I wanted to make it so that you guys could share it with your community too. Now, if you're done watching this video though, and you want to watch another one, here's a video I made about farmland, and here's a video I made about why we don't treat political elections like job interviews. If you enjoyed this fever dream of a video, you might like that one too.